it seems really apparent to me that people who know how to cook really well, or even more specifically, people who cook really well following recipes, have skills that are transferable to doing laboratory experiments, mostly of the kind that I assume most people would be thinking about when they think about laboratory experiments, which are the ones we most often associate. I say we, I used to most often associate with experiments in chemistry in the laboratory. And those experiments in the laboratory, you would see the different beakers and the Bunsen burners and all that stuff that you basically find in a junior high school, and even college chemistry classes in the labs that you would do there. That's what most people think of in laboratory experiments: pouring liquids here and there, heating stuff up, and mixing and all that. And really, there's a lot more similarities to cooking and doing laboratory experimentation and research. But more specifically, it's like the repeatability of experiments. So, very simply, when one laboratory or a group of scientists in their laboratory conducts an experiment or does some research, and then they publish, the reason for publishing is to share their findings, for one, and also to offer their completed research with as many details as possible so that it can be either verified or discredited, disproven by other scientists and researchers in other laboratories. And so, remember, I'm specifically talking about the kind of research that I most often think about as being done with a chemistry set, and how that is very similar to cooking, the cooking that uses recipes, and how that transfers over to the skills of being able to conduct these laboratory experiments. Because once something is published and it's put out there, other scientists can either verify it or disprove it by repeating the experiment. And, well, what do they have to do? They basically look at the recipe, basically look at the experimental recipe. And, cooking is to chemistry like repeating lab experiments. So let's look at it this way, right? In a recipe to cook something, just as in the lab, you would have to know, one, the types of ingredients, right? The eggs, the butter, the milk for a cake, for example. And in, chemistry, for example, it would be perhaps doing something with, gallium, arsenic, and, nitrogen, or something like that. And so then once you have identified the ingredients or the substances that you're using, then you have to determine what the amounts or proportions of those are, right? So from there, you then think about the order that you're going to mix or combine these ingredients or substances. And then there's a temperature, right? How how cold, because sometimes it's not always about heating things up, but also then how hot. So the temperature is very important. And finally, the the time that these ingredients or substances are to be subjected to those specific temperatures, and also the timing of when to mix the different ingredients. So That's really as simple as it is. And with even with a lot of the dancing around the subject and the fluff and introduction that I did there, I just got to that in under 5 minutes. And so again, that's what the different laboratory experiments are like. And it can be extended generally to how a lot of research and experimentation is done and the repeatability of experiments. They can basically be regarded as recipes. One laboratory will develop the experiment and then conduct it and then publish their results. And so that's the same thing as, finding a really, baking a really good cake, right? And then documenting how that really good cake or a dish of some kind. I'm saying cake because that's what most people think of baking, just like how most people, or at least, again, I'm saying most people, but really me, following recipes, I think of baking cakes, even though I don't eat a lot of cake. And scientific lab experiments I associate with, chemistry sets. But that's how it's done. It really is a good way to generalize and think about how experiments are done and how people know the things that they do in the field of science. Is why do so many people agree? Well, it's because it's been a lot of the published papers, right? They are peer reviewed, so reviewed by other people who are their peers, like for example, other people. So say for example, a laboratory full of PhDs in chemistry or PhDs in electrical engineering, those papers will be reviewed by their peers, other people who have PhDs in chemistry or PhDs in electrical engineering. And then some other people with degrees in electrical engineering and chemistry will set up their own laboratory experiments based on the recipe that was published in those papers. And then they follow it. They look at it and say, okay, what are these ingredients or substances that we need? What are the amounts or proportions of each one of those? What order do we mix them or combine them in? What temperature do we set this at? How cold or how hot? And then how long at that temperature? And during that process of time, when do we add those different substances, right? Because sometimes you might have something in being processed at a certain temperature for, let's say, 20 minutes, and then after that 20 minutes, then you have to add the other ingredient or substance. And again, that's really as simple as it is. If you want to think about scientifically how laboratory experiments are done, you can think about it like following a recipe. It's really a very useful way of understanding how laboratory science is done. And we can look at that all across things. When you start looking at research papers and things like that, if you do such a thing, then you're able to see that it's as simple as following a recipe. And that has been something that, at least for me, has been very apparent for a long time. It just seemed there was some similarity that popped out to me after looking at lots of different research papers, is they give such great details about everything that's being done, and it's so similar to following a recipe on a box or out of a recipe book. And that's what makes it very interesting. Chemists and cooks, they really do have a lot in common. They're the master chefs of the science world, those people who do laboratory experiments. So feast on that.